My name is Amy Stone. I'm the Extension Educator for Agriculture and Natural Resources in Lucas County. Today I'm going to speak to you about invasive species. I would like to cover an introduction to what is an invasive species, encourage you to participate in our Great Lakes Early Detection Network app and report invasive species that you may come across. We're going to talk about some plants, insects, and have a call to action. So let's begin by talking and defining what an invasive species is. An invasive species is defined as a species that is non-native, or some people refer to it as alien, to the ecosystem which we're describing or under consideration. What's also very important is this introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So it's not just the introduction of that species, but it's the ultimate impact that that species may have that causes adverse effects. An invasive species can be a plant, animal, or other organism, and human action usually is the primary means of that invasive species introduction or continued spread of that species. Just a little bit, there's some kind of confusion when we talk about invasive species. And what's important to remember is that if you have a native insect, disease, or plant, it cannot be termed invasive. And so sometimes we have maybe especially plants that are native to our region, maybe very aggressive, but they're not invasive. And so it's just kind of a particular point of interest. Therefore, so it's important to know that native species are termed aggressive rather than invasive. So non-native insects, diseases, or plants that cause economic, environmental, or harm to human health can be termed invasive. So let's talk. What makes a non-native invasive? It's an exploitable niche in the ecosystem. So they come in and they take advantage and take over, actually to the harm of other species within that ecosystem. There's nothing to restrict their dominance or their abundance. They often have limited natural enemies, which allows them to really then be aggressive and continue to expand their population. In this photo, this is an example of kudzu and how kudzu has taken over that environment by growing on and over plants in the existing environment. So they're taking over, they're creating a niche where it becomes a monoculture of just that species. Another example of a vine that is taking over in particular places across Ohio is porcelain berry, a plant that was brought into the country for ornamental characteristics and uses in our landscape and has escaped. Beautiful berries, totally understand why people are interested and would like to have this in their landscape, but unfortunately those seeds spread rapidly. There's a lot of seeds and it can become a problem and be very invasive. Our honeysuckles, one way that plants can grow really well in a situation is that they tend to grow up or green up quicker in the spring and stay green longer in the fall. And so they just have a longer growing season, which attributes to them having more opportunities in the ecosystem. And you can see the native plants and the surroundings are all still dormant, but that honeysuckle has greened up pretty quickly in the spring. Again, imported for an ornamental value with its flowers, fragrance, and fruit, but the population has exceeded anybody's expectations in a bad way. And it's those fruit that then the other wildlife can kind of come in and take advantage of, and wherever they go, they're spreading those seeds that then become additional plants in the future. When we talk about invasive species, we think about world trade and the movement of goods from across countries. There are many ports of entry. And potentially with each of those ports of entry is an opportunity for invasives to spread. I think it's important to realize that we're not going to stop world trade, but we do have to really pay attention to those hitchhikers and realize that we are always at risk. If only the insects were this large and this obvious when being shipped from place to place. But unfortunately, they're often hidden in pallets, in crates, even on the things that we're purchasing from other countries and kind of move into the country. So the movement of invasive species really is a global issue. And as we continue to receive and ship goods from one country to another, there is that potential of invasive species. I think it's also important to mention that no country is without risk of non-native pests. It seems like in North America we've been on the receiving end a lot of these invasive species. In recent years we've been dealing with things like emerald ash borer, Asian longhorn beetle, but realize that we too can ship native pests from North America to other countries, and they can be dealing with the same situation. So I'm going to put this picture up on the screen and ask if anybody knows what this moth is. Any guesses? It's actually our native fall webworm. Fall webworm is native to North America. Populations can increase and decrease. If I showed this photo earlier on, you may say, oh yeah, I've seen that before. We have native biological controls to kind of keep or regulate this pest in North America, and caterpillars really seldom cause significant damage. Aesthetically, we may see them and think, oh, that's horrible, or populations may grow, but soon they crash kind of on their own, and really it's not a big deal. But this insect was imported accidentally and was detected in China in the 1970s. It was given a different common name of the American white moth and acts very differently in China than it does in North America. There's no native biological controls in China, and so they've had outbreak populations which actually can kill trees and other plants where the infestations grow and get larger. So it's kind of just showing an example of a native insect in North America and how that can become a serious issue in other countries. So today we're going to talk about kind of some wanted pests that are out there. And these are some kind of the highlights that I get a lot of questions on. And so we're going to just kind of tip the surface and talk a little bit about those. Before we get into the actual pests, I do want to alert you to something that you can do. And so as you're out in your garden, maybe visiting metro parks or just out in your community, we have an app on a phone. It's called the Great Lakes Early Detection Network. And we're excited about this as a possible reporting option to kind of give us a handle on where invasive species are in Ohio and really the Great Lakes region. So you can download the app. It's a free app. Do just normal activities. So when you're outside, um, if you happen to see an invasive species, you can report that. Or there are individuals who are actually going out either because they have an interest or they're volunteering and they're looking specifically for invasive species and helping us report those. The cool thing about the app is you can report a positive find that you see, but if you're monitoring for a particular invasive and going back to an area again and again, you can report a negative infestation or so a negative find. So the insect, the plant, the disease isn't there, but it allows us to know that, hey, you're in that area looking for that particular pest. You can report what you see by taking a photo and describing the situation, and then you can take a look at the maps that are being developed as these reports come in. And so it's just a great tool that we were encouraging a lot of people to begin using or continue to use. The app is broken down by different categories of species, and so you can see there's quite a list. You can create your own species or category, and then it has my species list, a state species list, of course the negative survey that I mentioned, and we'll talk about how to upload those queued reports. So you'll go in, it's actually a great educational opportunity to kind of learn more about invasive species or some that maybe should be on your radar based by category. But you choose a category and then you kind of just get deeper into that category. So for the example right now, if we click on trees, there'll be a list of trees, and this is a list that multiple states have come up with, and so there may be a tree on this list that you think, gosh, that doesn't seem to be a problem in Ohio, but one of the partnering states, it is on their list, and so we really need to be concerned and kind of be on the lookout. You choose a particular plant of interest. There's images, and so there could be a variety of images from 1 to maybe 10 different photos of that particular species. So it helps to learn more about that species, especially if you're out in the field, you think that it may be one thing, but you're not for sure. You can compare it to some of those stacked images that are on the app. There's also information about the appearance, the foliage, kind of describes what that invasive species is. And then finally, there's the map. And this one, this particular report is about Oriental bittersweet. And so it takes the long and lat of where you're at. You can take a photo, which photos are really required, so we can make sure that it is indeed the species that you're reporting. You can talk about how much time you spent doing the report, and so this is important if you're volunteering and want the app to help you document that time spent. You can describe, is it an individual point or is it a large area where you would actually use a polygon? You're going to hit save and it's going to go to the upload queue. And so what's really kind of neat about this is you can make all these reports out in the field, get back to a wireless connection, and then those reports would be uploaded. On the Woodland Stewards website, if you want to learn more about the Great Lakes Early Detection, we actually have an entire webinar on how to use the app, how to download the app, and so hopefully if you're excited but I want to learn a little bit more, check out the Woodland Stewards website, and one of the Escape to the Forest programs is specifically on the Great Lakes Detection app. And so once those reports are uploaded and they're approved or verified because of the information that was also provided, they become an actual dot on the map. And so you can see here, going back to the Tree of Heaven example, somebody reported that just north of Akron. And then if we kind of broaden that map out, you can see where those additional reports have been made. And maybe areas where there haven't been reports that, boy, it's important that we get out there and realize that that particular invasive is in that part of the state. All right, so hopefully I've encouraged you and maybe tempted your interest a little bit, and you'll begin making reports on your own. So let's jump into some plants that we're going to just highlight real quickly. This plant, Japanese stiltgrass, seems to be one that we're seeing more reports or more questions about from the field. You can see it's almost kind of a little bit bamboo looking like, and it can become a carpet. And so, at first glance, you don't think anything about it. It's green, it's beautiful, but again, it's so aggressive, so invasive in its nature that it's going to outcompete other plants on the forest floor and really change that ecosystem or environment. So stiltgrass is thought to have been introduced in the early 1900s as actually packing material for porcelain in China, from China. It grows about 1.5 to 3 feet in height. It really loves moist, shady, and disturbed areas, so it finds that niche and can take over. It has a purplish hue in the fall, which is beautiful. A reason why people are like, oh, wait, I don't want to get rid of it. That has some characteristics that I like. But again, very aggressive in that it will take over an area. So you can see the leaves are asymmetrical. They're lance-shaped, thin, pale green in color in the early spring, and then progressing to this nice later fall color. It does have a shiny midrib along the upper leaf surface to kind of help you identify. Glyphosate products with an added surfactant can be very effective if you're trying to manage or control this particular invasive. It is important to note that when we talk about invasives, it is you're more easily able to control in small areas or isolated areas. Once the population kind of explodes and gets larger, obviously there's going to be more time, commitment associated with the control and management, and often more of a cost. Another invasive plant that I want to mention that should be on your radar is Japanese knotweed. Japanese knotweed spreads vegetatively by rhizomes and sprouts, and even fragments from root and stem material. And so if you're just hand removing it, cutting it back, the roots can then, if they're broken off, can provide another plant and expand its range. Or I've seen where they've cut it off and just kind of laid it on the soil, and it has actually rooted in. So very aggressive. Some of the populations will produce fertile seeds, although sometimes it was sold as a sterile plant for the landscape. It can be anywhere from 3 to 10 feet, depending on the situation and the vigor of the plant. It has simple alternating leaves that are about 6 inches long. The base of the leaf is very flat, and it tapers up to a point in the corner. It has a very deep taproot, and if you cut the stem, it's hollow, so almost like a straw. It has small, creamy white flowers that are arranged in spikes, as shown in the photo here. And so it's a late bloomer, late summer into early fall. And so we're just seeing that progression of the bloom right now in Ohio. The fruit is a winged seed, and it can be very prolific. It does tolerate semi-shade and can grow in full sun. It does prefer wet conditions, and so it can really take hold in that situation. But I've also seen it become pretty invasive in high dry conditions, and so it can take over in a wide range of situations. The next plant that I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier is the porcelain berry. It was actually introduced for horticultural purposes. You can see it's a woody vine with beautiful berries and shades of purples and pinks as it continues to grow. It does resemble grapevine, and sometimes people get that a little bit confused. I've seen situations where we've had native grapevine growing with the porcelain berry. It can climb about 20 feet in a year. The bark is ridged and furrowed in comparison to grapevine, which is more shredded or peeling. And so that would be one way to kind of differentiate between the two, especially in the winter when you don't have leaves and maybe most of the fruit has disappeared. The leaves are alternate on the stem, and they are heart-shaped with coarse leaves, although there can be a little bit of variation within the leaf. It flowers in midsummer, and right now we are seeing those berries continue to develop. They start out as yellow. They will then continue to turn purple and blue in color. The next plant that we're really seeing in Northwest Ohio is Oriental bittersweet. We do have a native bittersweet, which sometimes people are confused to which one they have, and we'll talk a little bit about what's happening between those two species as well in just a second. So Oriental bittersweet has these beautiful orange berries that the outside coating opens, and you see these kind of orange reddish type berries with the seeds underneath. Prefers full sun, but I've seen it establish in very dense woodlots and shade conditions. It's sometimes called the kudzu of the north, and so when kudzu was going gangbusters down south, this was kind of our invasive that we were dealing with that had kind of similar characteristics where it would grow up and over plants. But now, unfortunately, in Ohio, we have both. We have the kudzu and we're dealing with Oriental bittersweet. As I had mentioned, the yellow fruits split open in the fall and actually are kind of a prize fall decorations for some. But you have to be really cautious because if those fall decorations are used outdoors, the birds can still visit even if it's cut off in a wreath or in a container. They can eat those berries, fly off, and wherever they deposit those seeds, then we have the potential of more Oriental bittersweet popping up. Vines can climb more than 60 feet in a year, and so and they'll continue to grow year after year, become very, very aggressive and very dense. Oriental bittersweet has been known to displace our American bittersweet through competition, and we're also seeing where the plants are hybridizing, and so we now have plants that have characteristics of both, and unfortunately the aggressiveness of the plant is usually kind of continued through that generation, and so they're becoming an issue even if it's a cross between our native and non-native species. USGS has a great fact sheet that kind of describes and compares and contrasts our American bittersweet to the Oriental bittersweet, and is helpful if you have some bittersweet but you don't know for sure which one you have. As I had mentioned, it is a woody vine introduced to the United States in 1860 as an ornamental plant, and has really rapidly spread through much of North America. It's often found along forest edges and in forest gaps, fence rows, old fields, but the more I see it, it really is finding a niche in in shady areas as well as those full sun conditions where we initially saw it. Here's a link to that fact sheet, but what I really like, it kind of walks you through a key so you can determine if you have American, Oriental, or maybe a combination of the two. So great fact sheet, great resource to have, and it is very helpful. Next plant that we're going to talk about is buckthorn, and we actually have two different kinds of buckthorn in Ohio. Common buckthorn is a deciduous shrub. It can get 15 to 20 feet, and I've seen it actually top out higher than that in some areas where it has been allowed to grow. The leaves are smooth, dark, and deeply veined. They're kind of egg-shaped, where they're pointed at the tip and more rounded at the base. If we dive a little bit deeper, the leaves are finely toothed around the margins. There's usually 3 to 5 pairs of curved kind of towards the tip veins, and so they're almost running parallel in the middle of that leaf. The twigs are arranged opposite, and you can see there's a short spine, or some people would call a thorn, associated with this plant. It flowers in large clusters. They're green on female plants in the spring, and so not overly showy, but obviously present. The fruits grow in large clusters. They're black, kind of berry-like, can be up to 1/4 of an inch in size. If you scrape the bark of the tree, it has this really orange inner bark. And so that's a nice characteristic. If you're out in the field and you're not sure if that's what it is, just scrape a little, an area on that trunk or on a branch, and you'll see this inner bark that's orange if it's common buckthorn. The next buckthorn that I'm going to talk about is glossy buckthorn. It's a deciduous small tree, 25 to 30 feet in height. The leaves are smooth, dark, and glossy. They're elliptical to oval shape, so a little bit more kind of squatty than common buckthorn. They are a 1/2 inch to nearly 3 inches in length. They have smooth leaf margins, and they have 8 to 9 pairs of arched veins that don't curve towards the leaf tip, and so you can see the veins radiate out, but rather than come back. And so that could be a key or a characteristic when you're comparing the two to determine if you have common buckthorn or glossy buckthorn. The leaves and twigs are alternately arranged, so the same as glossy and common. There's no spine or thorn on glossy. The fruit are in small clusters, usually in shades of red to brown to purple to black as they mature. The inner bark on the glossy buckthorn is also orange, like I described in the common. Here's just a comparison, looking really closely at those veins. So common on the left, how they kind of curve back to that tip point, where glossy radiate out and don't come back. And so just a characteristic if you're out in the field and trying to determine which buckthorn you have or you're dealing with. All right, so another plant that we're going to talk about is calorie pear. Probably maybe on most people's radar. You've probably noticed an increase, especially in the spring when these are in bloom, kind of in natural areas, roadsides, taking over in particular areas. And you might actually even have one in your neighborhood, in your own landscape, and we're going to talk about why calorie pear is such an issue. So the calorie pear story begins. It's actually an Asian native, and it was introduced in the early 1900s for its gene resistance for bacterial fire blight. And so it was brought to the country for researching purposes, for taking the genes from this plant to hopefully providing or building a eating pear that would be resistant to fire blight. It really didn't have any disease or insect pests. They were non-existent, which kind of was like interesting to some breeders that, hey, this plant doesn't have pest issues that we've dealt with our native pears. Early in the 1960s, it was actually selected as an excellent candidate for a street tree because of the lack of insect and disease pests, its potential for resistance to fire blight. It had white flowers, glossy green foliage, and excellent fall color, so all positives as we relate to ornamental plants in the landscape. And I think very importantly to identify or talk about is that all cultivars were self-incompatible or self-infertile. And so they didn't produce a lot of fruit, and if they did, that fruit was not viable. And so the plant got planted in a lot of places to the point where it kind of was becoming a monoculture in some communities. It was a pretty inexpensive plant, easily to get a hold of, and so a lot of developers used this as a street tree as they were finishing out developments, and it soon became a very common plant that we saw in our communities. And for good reason, right? Great fall color, nice flowers, although they're pretty stinky. And so the plant did have some good characteristics. In fact, Michael Durr, who's kind of the woody ornamental guru, he has a wonderful book if you're not familiar with it, The Manual of Woody Ornamentals. Great textbook that a lot of colleges and universities use for their woody plant ID, but you know, this is a panacea. This is the perfect tree. You can stick it into any planting site in the urban environment, whether it's, you know, concrete like clay soil, limestone soils, acidic soils, and it grows. And so hence the reason it was planted in a lot of situations. But after 20 years, it was highly planted, heavily distributed in our communities. It kind of lost favor because as this tree continues to mature, it has really weak branch nodes, and so in a storm you could lose a third of the plant, and it really impacted the overall look of that plant. And so, I mean, it was noted that they had weak branch crotch angles, but that kind of got people looking, okay, can we develop one that has better structure? And that occurred. And so back to just the Bradford, though, it kind of became a curse word with especially urban foresters or landscapers who were then having to deal with these maturing plants that were weak and became a problem in the landscape. So other cultivars were selected and chosen because they had a better structure. And so the invasion began. And so all of a sudden we noticed these seedlings popping up that had a lot of fruit. Some of them actually had thorns. And so you can see here this excess fruit, and kind of look in the back, it's kind of a weedier natural area, not maintained by mowing grass. They were popping up in these natural areas, and so when you see these bloom in the spring, if you've not noticed, spring of 2021, just kind of take a look around, and it's amazing the distribution of these, and it's by birds, right? So they eat the seeds, they move on and distribute the seeds to the next generation. This is taken a photo by Joe Boggs just off of 75 in southwest Ohio, where it's literally a field of pears. This is taken going into Columbus, but I think anywhere across the state where pears are planted for ornamental purposes, you're starting to see this occur. As I had mentioned, the wild seedlings of the Callery pear have these spurs, or some people call thorns, and that's a native characteristic of the plant that was kind of bred out of the plant for good reason, but it's back there in its genetics, and so they can actually become pretty dangerous as you're trying to remove them and have a thicket of pear popping up with these thorns. So one thing that's important, recently the Ohio Department of Agriculture has taken over the regulation of invasive plants, and so they've come up with a list of plants that are invasive. They can't be sold or planted and are now regulated in Ohio. We're going to take a closer look at just this one sentence. So in addition to their lists that are already regulated, the European wand loosestrife was added to that list in January of 2019, and Callery pear will be officially added to the list in January of 2023. So although it's still legal to plant and sell, on the horizon, this will change in Ohio. If you want to learn more about invasive plants, this is a great publication from USDA, New Invaders of Northeast and North Central. And so great photos, great descriptions. Would highly recommend this publication that's available for free online. And so just you can search for that and add that to your library of resources. So we're going to jump from plants to insect pests, and I'm going to start out with one that needs to be on everyone's radar. This is the spotted lanternfly. Native range includes China, but some other countries or other areas. In North America, it showed up for the first time in the fall of 2014 in southeastern Pennsylvania, and obviously now is in multiple counties. I think they're up to 26 counties in Pennsylvania. There are active infestations in addition to Pennsylvania in several other states in the Northeast. And then you'll notice that I've listed some other states that have various life stages found. And Ohio is one of those states. And so it's not a reproducing population at this point. So likely it was a hitchhiker that was on a vehicle, or maybe an egg mass on something that was transported but was able to be removed and destroyed prior to it becoming established. But we know that it has arrived in Ohio in this manner, and so we really need to be on the lookout for that. We're going to talk just a little bit about preferred hosts. And so tree of heaven, or Ailanthus, which is another invasive species, tends to be a favorite of the adult especially. The adults also like grapes, but will also attack or be present on other fruit crops like apples and peaches. And then also there's observations of it feeding on hops. And so with that said, it really does like tree of heaven. And so if you have tree of heaven in your area, you can help us monitor for spotted lanternfly, and you can use the Great Lakes Early Detection app to make those reports. This is a much broader host range, and so as nymphs, and we'll talk about life cycle in just a little bit, they can feed on over 70 different plants, and it seems to be those observations are continuing to increase. They can be, annuals like basil. They can be plants in our garden, cucumbers, tomatoes, things like that. And then, of course, our perennial and woody plants. And so this list was developed in Virginia after they had their initial find. Eggs were found on the plants that are listed to the far left of the screen. And you'll notice plants, 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 and then at the bottom, a concrete wall and then a metal drum. So they can lay eggs on anything. This is a list of plants that they've noticed feeding on, so not necessarily egg masses, but the nymphs and adults moved off the egg mass as they hatched, and they found these plants to their liking. So pretty broad host range, especially as the insect is in the nymph stage. So possibly 70 host plants. That may be increasing as people see or observe more feeding injury, but pretty wide host range to begin with. The adults, which we would be seeing right now, they're in that stage of their life, are 1 inch long to about a 1/2 inch wide. Very vibrant, beautiful insects. The adults and the nymphs are both insects that will pierce into the plant material. They have piercing and sucking mouth parts, and you can see that kind of looks almost like a straw that they're using to pierce in and then get that sap, the sugars from the plant. They are stem feeders or trunk feeders, and their mouth parts pierce in as illustrated in this drawing. The impact is that they then can cause the plants to bleed sap. This sap is then attracted to something called black sooty mold, which can actually be something to look for in high infestations where the forest floor turns black or the stems or leaves underneath where this feeding occurred and the sap accumulates can turn black. The insects like yellow jackets and hornets are attracted to the sap, and so if you see these insects kind of being drawn to an area, especially under plants or around plants like ailanthus, this would be something to look into and look for other signs and symptoms of spotted lanternfly. The adults, like I had mentioned, appear now in late summer, and they will be present until we have a really good freeze. Although they're bright and brilliant and really kind of stand out, you'll notice here, depending on the bark texture, they can almost camouflage themselves in. Here's a photo of the two mating, and then they'll lay eggs, the females, in rows or chains, kind of in a mass, and there can be 30 to 50 eggs, and she can lay a couple of egg masses in her lifetime. The eggs then are covered with this waxy coating that is real smooth to begin with, but then as it ages it cracks and almost looks kind of mud-like in appearance. So you can see here that smooth kind of waxy appearance. You can see some of the eggs that are kind of exposed at the top of that egg mass. Here's a spotted lanternfly egg mass in comparison to a gypsy moth egg mass. And multiple egg masses. They can be laid on any surface, so it could be trees, it could be plants, it could be any flat surface like this metal drum. And it appears like they like to lay eggs on metal and rusty things, so be on the lookout for that. There's also a concern that they could be laying eggs on vehicular things like trains, semis, trailers, vehicles that then could be moved kind of great distances from one place to another. The nymphs hatch in the spring. There are 4 instars or stages. The first 3 instars or stages are black with white spots. And as they develop into that fourth instar, they have these patches of kind of red or reddish orange color to them. So those are the two kind of color forms that we'll see, first through third instar, black and white, with the added red at the fourth instar stage. If we look at this calendar, they are in the egg mass stage for their longest period of time. You can see the nymphs are present usually the end of April through October, with the adults beginning late July, probably into August, with peak into September, October, and then through that first freeze. There is one generation per year, but we're concerned with those eggs. So it's the longest stage and the stage that is probably most responsible for human-assisted spread. So moving egg masses kind of great distances potentially, and wherever that egg mass is in the spring and hatches can become a new population. They are weak flyers, although they can kind of congregate in mass and get into wind currents. But for moving from one place to another or from one state to another, they'll be the hitchhikers that are the concern. So monitoring for tree of heaven is very important. Obviously, we'd like to reduce that invasive plant. But while you're doing that, working in Ailanthus, really look for signs and symptoms. And so you can see here some seeds as they develop, as they mature, and those female Ailanthus especially really stand out this time of the year as the mature seeds are ripening. Our next insect is gypsy moth. So we've talked about an insect that's kind of on the radar coming to Ohio, next to an insect that's been in Ohio for a very long time. There are different color kind of stages or color forms that sometimes can be a little bit confusing. They can also be confused with a native caterpillar called the forest tent caterpillar. Both will defoliate oak trees especially, and both can produce outbreaks. The difference is gypsy moth is non-native and forest tent caterpillars are native. So if we look at the gypsy moth caterpillar, there's really no insect that's like that. And so we've got 6 rows of red dots followed by 5 rows of blue dots. And actually I kind of set it in reverse order. So we've got the blue dots up by the head end, followed by the red that are following the blue. And so there's just nothing else like that. In comparison, the forest tent caterpillar has its kind of spots down the back end, and some people describe it as almost like they look like footprints or markings. Gypsy moth can be a potential tree killer. They are foliage feeders, but that can vary among the species that they're eating. And so deciduous plants like oaks, it can take 2, 3, 4 years of defoliation to actually kill that plant. Whereas spruce or evergreens, it can kill in a single season. And so our deciduous trees will send out new leaves after that injury occurs in the spring and in summer. But the evergreens aren't able to do that. And so it can be a death sentence in that first season if gypsy moths get on. Spruce tend to be kind of their favorite host. And you can see as that defoliation has progressed throughout the season, and finally all the needles are gone. And so there's really no hope for this evergreen. And so that would have to be removed from the landscape. It does provide, though, an impact of stressing plants. And so when they defoliate and eat all the leaves off of a deciduous plant, it does take reserve and energy for that plant to send out new leaves, and that can become pretty stressful. Defoliation occurs in the early spring, and that's why this is so important. Or can be so devastating, because it's early in the season where they need the rest of the season to continue to have leaves to be those food factories for the plant to continue to grow. General rule is if defoliation is greater than 50%, it's going to really ultimately impact the overall health of the plant. If it's less than 50%, most healthy plants can recover. So this really wouldn't be the case. So if this plant, already stressed to begin with, is defoliated, it could be a death sentence rather quickly. So if we take a look at life cycle, right now gypsy moth is in the egg mass stage, and it'll be in that stage through the fall, into winter, into early spring. There are 50 to hundreds of eggs that are present in one egg mass that's kind of covered up by the hairs from her abdomen, almost like a blanket. In the early spring, those eggs are going to hatch about the same time that red bud is blooming. The first instars will balloon. They'll start to feed. If they don't like that particular plant, they'll suspend themselves or balloon from a silken thread, get caught up in the wind currents, and find another plant to feed on. Those caterpillars are pretty small when they hatch and usually go undetected. It's not until later instars where they're feeding heavier, their caterpillars are larger, that people really notice that injury. Through the midsummer, they're going to pupate, and so you'll see here where they're kind of transforming from that caterpillar to the adult moth. And you can see the adult moth who's been mated is then laying the egg mass for the next year. So distribution can occur during the egg stage, and so this is when eggs are laid on plant material, any outdoor furniture, vehicles, firewood, and moved great distances. They can also move as first instar, second instar caterpillars where they balloon and get caught up in the wind currents. And then when we talk about control options, so typically that is going to be in the caterpillar stage. BT is very effective when the caterpillars are small, and then we go into some more insect growth regulators and other insecticides when the caterpillars get a little bit larger. At this point, there's really nothing can be done at the pupation. There's no means or no need to control the adults as they don't cause additional injury. But the Department of Agriculture uses some traps to monitor for adult moths. And so you may see those traps out and about. The original infestation was in Bedford, Massachusetts, was that point of introduction, and that was in the 1800s, and so it's kind of moved westward since that point of introduction. When we look on the large scale, there's actually 3 management zones when we talk about gypsy moth. There is the suppression or the quarantine zone, which is the red area. There's the slow the spread, where a lot of management efforts are in place. And then finally, there's the eradication zone, where if gypsy moth is found in one of the purple areas, it's treated for eradication and elimination. And so we're not going to get rid of gypsy moth in North America, but we want to manage it and kind of even push it back into that suppression zone to slow its spread. If we take a look in Ohio, again, management depends on the location. So we definitely have an area of suppression. We do have an area of slow the spread and eradication. So we have 3 management areas within the state. This was 5+ years ago, right? And so if you look into 2020, we've actually kind of, that slow the spread has been pushed back into the suppression zone because of all the good things that are happening as far as management of gypsy moth. Our next insect that we're going to cover is Asian longhorn beetle. And so Asian longhorn beetle in North America are very what we call isolated small populations. If you're living in one of those areas, you may not think of it as a small isolated population, but if you look at the country as a whole, they're few and far between, it was good. They're relatively small and distinct in their size in the area that they are at. The goal is eradication. I mentioned this with gypsy moth, where they're eradicating some. The goal for Asian longhorn beetle is to eradicate all populations in North America. Eradication has been successful and continues to be the goal of that program. In every infestation, there's the initial infestation, and they actually are doing DNA analysis to know where those populations are coming from. And then once the population gets into an area, we often see multiple smaller populations, and that's kind of the natural and even unnatural or human-assisted spread of the insect, but in a relatively small area. So you've got your point of introduction and then these little hot spots that occur in that given area. It is important to know that those single point of introduction are directly from Asia. And so in most cases, the populations are specific introductions. And so we as humans aren't moving that from place to place. The Asian longhorn beetle is a cerambycid. It gets its name because of the long antenna, and you'll notice the black and white banding on that antenna. It's a pretty large beetle, not quite as large as depicted in this image, but a little humor to get us through talking about all these bad invasives. The female beetle is larger. And again, here's some eradication photos. So slightly doctored images, but seriously, the insect is rather large. It can range in size from 3/4 of an inch to 1.5 inches in length, and usually are over 1 inch long. And so you can see that size of the insect with the hand and the penny to give you a perspective. They are round-headed borers, and so that is the first thoracic segment. And you can see in the larvae between the powerful chewing parts of that insect. I call it the Michelin tire man. So it's a large larvae, round, kind of beefy in appearance. And it continues to grow, and so very large in comparison to, some people may be familiar with the emerald ash borer, which is very flat. Note that there are native roundhead borers in North America. Those are attracted to dead and dying trees. And so if you have firewood or a tree that's dead, you may see one of the native longhorn beetles and come across that. We're going to talk a little bit about the host range of Asian longhorn beetle. And so very good host range are the maples. And in fact, of the trees that are infested in southwest Ohio, in Claremont County, 98.6% of those trees are maples. And you can see the breakdown from red, sugar, and silver. Horse chestnuts and buckeyes, elms, and willows are also on that list, as well as a slew of other plants. And so very broad host range, 12 trees. The genuses are called high risk when we talk about eradication programs. And so those plants come from 9 different plant families, so very broad host range. The Asian longhorn beetle has a tree-killing behavior. They love maples. They attack healthy and stressed trees. They will feed in the stems and the branches. And you can see here, maples have diffused porous trees, or a makeup. And so when they feed on the stem, the insect is going to first chew a pit where she lays an egg. And so those are some illustrations, photos of where she's kind of chewed that pit or divot, laid the egg. The egg hatches, and first and second instars begin feeding just underneath the bark and then go into kind of the center or the heartwood of the plant. And so this damage causes those branches to become weak. And so you can see the actual feeding injury here, not just underneath the bark, but into the entire center of the plant. And then woodpeckers will go after the larvae that are inside feeding. Again, not just under the bark, but they're excavating in to go find that larvae. And so what happens when that tissue is disrupted, there is substantial damage to those branches. You can see here in the kind of center of that photo is a larvae that's in the center that was feeding. It weakens the branches, and we get branch breakage. And so that's a key characteristic of something to look for. Important take-home message, thinning canopy is not a reliable diagnostic symptom for detecting Asian longhorn beetle. The tree to the left behind that truck is highly infested, yet it still has a pretty thick canopy, and so you can see all the activity on those branches as the tree was cut down. I mean, this tree was really infested. And so we're going to just finish up here with what to look for. In heavily infested trees, you're going to see branch breakage. You're going to see that feeding injury. You'll see where the insect emerged from the tree, but then also those areas where she was chewing and laying eggs. You'll see some bark splitting, kind of callousing that tissue over where the insect was feeding. So anything unusual, you'll see holes, and they're perfectly round exit holes, pretty good size that you can stick a number 2 pencil into. And you can see that illustrated here. And so it goes deep into that center of the tree. Finally, that woodpecker activity, the pits where she was chewing to lay the eggs, ultimately some sap running as a result of that injury, and frass. So they kick the frass out, they don't collect that inside, and you can see that accumulate in the crotches of branches or around the base of the tree. And then, of course, the actual beetles themselves, especially in the later summer into the fall when they're out in the environment, doing some feeding themselves, finding a mate, and then laying eggs for the next generation. And then, of course, if you cut into the tree, you may actually see the larvae as well. And so be on the lookout for Asian longhorn beetle, as well as any other plants that and pests that we talked about today. Hopefully my talk with you gave you a kind of a brief highlight of some of the invasives that could be on your radar. I encourage you to again download the Great Lakes Early Detection app and get that going. Get your reports in so we can verify those and help us fight the battle of invasive species here in Ohio. We're winding down on time, but I do want to just again thank you for your interest. If you have any questions or follow-up, don't hesitate to send me an email. That address is stone, S-T-O-N-E, .91 @osu.edu. Again, thank you, and you guys have a great day.